Avatar: The Last Airbender is a series that had absolutely no business being as high quality as it was. Airing on Nickelodeon in 2005, its primary contemporaries were the likes of SpongeBob SquarePants and The Fairly Odd Parents. Straightforward episodic comedies that were certainly entertaining in their own right, but didn't really challenge or stick with you in any significant way. And Avatar: The Last Airbender is decidedly not that. It's a fantasy epic with long-running story arcs and a fully realized world that feels lived in, filled with vibrant locations and unique and interesting creatures. Its characters grow and change and make mistakes and learn from them, and it explores themes of trauma, abuse, imperialism, spirituality, environmentalism, and so much more. And that's saying nothing of the beautiful animation and art style and the interesting magic system that feeds back into the themes of the series. If the creators had put in half the effort, it would still be considered a modern classic, spoken of only in hushed, reverent tones. But thankfully, we live in a timeline where they gave it a level of care and attention that is unrivaled in the world of Western animation, and we should feel blessed that that is the case. All that to say, I'm going to be breaking down each episode of the series and highlighting everything that makes it beloved by so many. I hope you'll join me, and until I see you next, Avatar State Yip Yip. The thing that I find most impressive about The Boy and the Iceberg is how consistent it is with the remainder of the series. When television shows run for several years, it's natural that some elements of them will evolve as the creators get a better idea of their vision for the story. So the fact that it deviates so little from the pilot over its 3-season run is a testament to all of the upfront planning and effort that the creators put into Avatar: The Last Airbender. There are small details like Ba Sing Se appearing on the world map that's present in the background of Katara's opening monologue, but there are also larger character beats like Iroh's instruction to Zuko to draw firebending power from the breath rather than the muscle, which is indicative of the way that firebending practice has changed over the course of the war and hints at the fact that Iroh is more rooted in the old traditions. Moments that seem like throwaway lines have direct narrative connections to major development that our characters are going to go through in later portions of the series. And the fact that all of these seeds were planted in the first episode is nothing short of writing genius. The pilot episodes of Avatar: The Last Airbender do so much to establish the personalities of our 4 main characters. And in so doing, it also establishes one of the core themes of the series, which is that your greatest strength can also be the source of your weakness. Aang's mastery of airbending makes him quick-witted and light on his feet, but it also makes him flighty and evasive when it comes to responsibility. Zuko's focus and determination are the qualities that allowed him to survive his banishment, but they also cause him to have tunnel vision and not consider the consequences of his actions. Katara's emotional openness enables her to easily connect with other people and gives her a great deal of hope for the future, but it also makes her prone to violent outbursts. And the inverse, that weakness can become strength, is also true in the case of Sokka. His lack of bending and general physical prowess requires him to develop a tactical and resourceful mindset. And for all of our main characters, understanding this duality is the first step to real character growth. Commander Zhao is a deceptively brilliant character in the way that he represents the Fire Nation's war machine, and he's particularly interesting in the way that he interacts with our main characters. Because in Book 1 of the show, the Fire Nation is still a relatively abstract threat to the gang. The antagonist they have the greatest personal relationship to is Zuko, but we can see in this episode that Zuko is fully an outsider from the perspective of the Fire Nation. So while Zhao is antagonistic to Aang in a generalized evil empire sense, he has a much more personal beef with Zuko. Zuko is still technically the rightful heir to the Fire Nation's throne, but to Zhao he represents the very weakness that needs to be excised from the Fire Nation in order for them to win the war. And this is very much a running theme with Avatar: The Last Airbender's villains. They want to defeat and capture Aang as a matter of military pragmatism, but they want to eliminate Zuko out of a deep personal contempt for his ideology. There are a litany of great things I could cover when it comes to the warriors of Kyoshi. From excellent character moments for Sokka, the setup and payoff of the Unagi, and of course the introduction of Foaming Mouth Guy. But what I really want to talk about is the 15 seconds dedicated to portraying the spread of information about Aang being on Kyoshi Island, because it's one of the most efficient moments of storytelling that I've ever seen. There's the obvious narrative utility of giving an excuse for Zuko to show up in the third act, and it provides an in-universe explanation for why the gang needs to constantly move around. But it also highlights the interconnectedness of the world of Avatar. One of the biggest ideas that the series explores is that the divisions that we draw between ourselves and others are often arbitrary and imagined. And showing how quickly and easily a rumor is able to spread across national lines is a brilliantly subtle way of depicting that. Bad gas travels fast in a small town, and moments like this help us to remember that the world is quite a bit smaller than we realize. My mission in life is to live as closely as possible to the example set by King Bumi. In my later years, I'm going to be an absolute menace to society, and there's nothing anyone can do to stop me. One of the best aspects of Avatar's world building is the way that bending is incorporated at every level of society. When a significant portion of your population is able to manipulate the physical world at will, it will naturally change the way you go about doing things. You can see it in how it's difficult to even access the air temples without airbending, and you can see how the absence of bending has affected the Southern Water Tribe. It has substantially less robust infrastructure than other populated areas, in no small part because Katara is the only waterbender. And Omashu's delivery system continues this trend by having everyday life in the city depend on the presence of earthbenders. If bending only existed to be a cool magic system for fighting, then that would still be perfectly fine. But the creators taking the time to consider how it would affect other aspects of daily life makes it that much more well integrated into the world. If there's one thing I know with absolute certainty, it's that the old man in the mineshaft is the biggest rat bastard in all of fiction. Anyways, how many kids shows do you know of that explore the effects of colonization? Imperial powers have a long history of extracting natural and financial resources from the cultures that they colonize. And in order to maintain their chokehold on those resources, they often have to extinguish the cultural practices and identity of the locals. And this can cause profound psychological trauma in these cultures long past the point that they're still officially being colonized. Now, Avatar is a kids' show, so it was never going to explore the full depths of the horror of imperialism, but the fact that it respected the kids in its audience enough to explore these ideas at all is one of the biggest reasons why Avatar has stood the test of time. Kids are smarter and more capable than a lot of adults are willing to give them credit for, and they deserve more stories that explore these kinds of ideas. Also, Tyro wins coldest line in Book 1 for
"Don't worry, I hear cowards float."
I gotta be honest, I didn't really like this episode when I was a kid. Monster Form Heibai was just a little bit too scary for little 9-year-old Kevin. But now as an adult, I really appreciate all of the subtleties of how spirits are utilized in Avatar. It would be unusual to try to assign a moral character to nature. A forest is neither benevolent nor malevolent, it simply is. But when we as people think of ourselves as separate from nature and haphazardly destroy natural environments for our own benefit, it almost invariably comes back to haunt us in ways we never could have even realized. And often, the people who are hurt most had nothing to do with the destruction in the first place. In the same way, Heibai is neither nature's wrath nor nature's protection. He is merely a part of nature responding to external stimulus. And whether he exists peacefully with us or violently against us is entirely contingent on how we treat him first. This episode is incredibly significant for a first-time viewer, because while we've gotten hints of the complexities of Iroh and Zuko, Xiaoyu is the first genuine good guy firebender that we meet in the series. When we first meet the Fire Sages, we have a brief hope that they'll have some allegiance to the Avatar, only to learn that they serve Fire Lord Ozai. But Xiaoyu turning around and helping Team Avatar shows that while the Fire Lord's reach is great, it is not absolute. This episode is also the first time we get a glimpse of Aang's true full power. He's entered the Avatar state a few times already, but when Roku takes control, we see not only the overwhelming strength, but also the precision of a fully realized Avatar. He's an absolute force of nature, tearing apart the Fire Temple in a matter of seconds, but he also safeguards the lives of those not aligned with Ozai. And Zuko's departure is just ambiguous enough that you have to ask whether he escaped or he was intentionally spared. Did Katara recklessly endanger the gang by stealing the waterbending scroll? Yeah, a little. But it is always, and I do mean always, ethically correct to reclaim stolen cultural artifacts. Book 1 is much more heavily episodic than books 2 and 3, but we can still see early on the way that the lessons characters learn stay with them throughout multiple episodes. Now that Aang has unofficially started his waterbending training, he'll have it as a tool in his tool belt for future encounters. But an example that's easier to overlook is the way that Sokka tricks the pirates and Zuko into fighting each other. Before his training with Suki, Sokka's go-to move in any situation was brute force. But his brief time with the Kyoshi warriors has led him to rely more on his tactical mind and to use his opponent's strength against them. You could even make the argument that this is him, and by extension the Kyoshi warriors, exhibiting a waterbending mindset. And this reinforces the idea that true strength is a result of drawing wisdom from multiple sources. Jet is one of the most tragic characters in all of Avatar. I'll definitely be talking about him more when he returns later in the story, but this episode gives him incredibly strong characterization. Like all of our main characters, Jet suffered extreme personal tragedy as a result of the war, but unlike our main characters, he was immediately thrust into a position where he had to act as the primary support system for other kids with similar tragedies. And while in this episode he's most heavily paralleled with Sokka, the character he reminds me the most of is Zuko. Specifically, he's the type of person that Zuko might have become if he hadn't had the guidance of his uncle Iroh. And I don't want to get too ahead of the story, but the fact that he works so well as a foil for Zuko ends up working out amazingly later on, whether it was intentional or not. This episode is also the introduction of the best side character in Avatar, Sokka's instincts. The Great Divide is the episode of Avatar that has most strongly experienced what I like to call the Maractus effect. Maractus is a Pokemon where there really isn't anything wrong with it, it's just introduced at a point in the game where it's surrounded by substantially better options. As a result of this, most players don't really take the opportunity to form a strong emotional connection with it. But in the 12 years since its introduction, its mediocrity has caused it to gain great notoriety among fans. Paradoxically, it is incredibly memorable because of its forgettability. And that is, in essence, the fan reaction to The Great Divide. It's really a perfectly fine episode. There's nothing particularly memorable or interesting about it, but because it's surrounded by such amazing storytelling, the badness of it has been inflated in the fandom in the decades since its release. And I'm not going to make the argument that it's actually much better than a lot of fans make it out to be, because it's not, but one skip out of 60 episodes is a much better ratio than I've seen in other shows. Ignoring The Great Divide, Book 1 really is wall-to-wall bangers, but The Storm is just that episode. And like all great episodes of Avatar, its emotional core is the parallels between Aang and Zuko. Aang was forced to take on the responsibility of being the Avatar before the appropriate time, and he understandably tried to run away in a desperate attempt to cling on to his childhood for just a little bit longer. He blames himself for all of the suffering caused by the war, but what he doesn't understand is that he never should have been put in that position in the first place. Similarly, Zuko resents himself for not being able to live up to the cruelty that the Fire Nation expected of him. After being scarred and banished by Ozai, instead of recognizing it for the abuse that it was, he fully internalizes the lie that kindness is weakness. Neither of them is responsible for all of the pain that they've experienced, but because of their experiences, both of them have the power to end the cycle of violence. The Blue Spirit is one of those episodes that makes me think of the meme where it's an alignment chart from D&D, but it's just Zuko in all 9 panels. And I'm not the first, nor will I be the last, to say that that is just solid character writing, baby. And the thing that makes Zuko such a compelling character is how believable he is at every point of his journey. In Book 1, everything he does revolves around trying to capture Aang, and while there were a few moments where he would set that goal aside for the sake of helping Iroh or his crew, there's never a moment where he questions whether he should be trying to capture Aang at all. Even as the Blue Spirit, he doesn't recognize or respect Aang's humanity, he simply sees Aang as a trophy that Zhao stole from him. If his back were truly against the wall, Zuko wouldn't have hesitated to kill Aang, even if it meant having to start his search from scratch. But while Zuko doesn't respect Aang's humanity, Aang respects Zuko's, and every act of kindness that the gang shows Zuko inches him one step closer to redemption. I do want to go on record saying that I really love romance stories, but most action writers are terrible at writing romance, and I wish they would stop trying. And unfortunately, Avatar is not the exception to that rule. The romantic subplots are at best inoffensive, and at worst incredibly tedious and annoying. And this is the last time I'm going to mention the romance in Avatar. I don't like it, and I don't want to talk about it. On a much, much brighter note, Sokka is my favorite character in Avatar, and this is an amazing episode for him. He's the primary comic relief character, and he's almost always the butt of the joke, but he's also the voice of reason a majority of the time for the gang, and it's that duality that I really appreciate about him. And this episode shows that in spite of how judgmental he can be of other people, his number one priority is always the protection of innocent life. Also, Aang not caring at all when Aunt Wu is talking about his inevitable fight with Ozai is genuinely an amazing character moment for him. I've seen a surprising amount of people very harshly criticize Aang for hiding the message to Bato. And on one level, I kinda get it, because Aang deprived Sokka and Katara of potentially their last chance to ever see their dad, and as a card-carrying member of the Dead Dad Club, that's an incredibly significant thing to take away from someone. But I really can't help but sympathize with Aang. Katara and Sokka are almost literally his only friends in the entire world. Even if he believes that they genuinely think of him as family, he also knows how significant seeing Hakoda would be to them. I'm not saying that hiding the message was a good decision, but if I were in his position, I would be absolutely terrified at the prospect of parting ways with the two of them. And I would be lying if I said that I wouldn't genuinely consider doing the same thing. Thankfully, even though they've only been together for a short time, the bonds in Team Avatar are stronger than any impulsive decision that any of them might make in their lowest moments. Firebending is not necessarily masculine coded on the whole in Avatar, but this episode's story works as a strong metaphor for healthy masculinity versus toxic masculinity, and particularly the way that imperialist cultures incentivize and weaponize male aggression. One of the more subtle and insidious things about the way that the Fire Nation is portrayed in Avatar is the way that bending has been relegated to being a strictly martial exercise. The other nations use bending for transportation, infrastructure, or fun. And even in this episode, when firebending is used as a form of entertainment, ingrained into the show is the spectacle and danger of it. And fire can obviously be dangerous and destructive when it's not handled with appropriate care, but fire is also used to warm our homes and cook our food. It provides a sense of safety and comfort on a primal level in human beings. In the same way, masculinity can be violent and aggressive, but it can also be nurturing and supportive. And the most dangerous lie of patriarchy is that it can only ever be the former. Okay kids, your Avatar Easter egg of the day is that the schematics for the drill can be seen in the machinist's workshop. Anyways, there's a lot to say about the way that Avatar portrays disability, and I'm definitely going to get a lot of opportunity to talk about this in the future, but what I appreciate about Teo is that he is first introduced as a kid with the spirit of an airbender, and only after that is established do we learn that he is wheelchair-bound. Too often in media, and especially kids media, characters with disabilities are only used as tools to teach the audience about tolerance and compassion. But ironically, the characters are almost always reduced to centering entirely around their disability, reinforcing the very stigma they were intended to combat. So by having characters whose experiences are informed by but not defined by their disability is a major step in the right direction. Also, a minor thing that I love is when the writers incorporate a small science lesson into the narrative of the episode, like how in real life we need to add odor in order to be able to detect natural gas. The Northern Water Tribe is probably my favorite location in all of Avatar, and I could gush for hours about the art and animation in this episode, but the real star of the show here is Katara. I absolutely adore Katara as a character, and this episode is an incredible defining moment for her and the series as a whole. The stated goal of Team Avatar is to restore balance to the world by bringing an end to the war. But this episode asks, how can we possibly say that we've achieved balance if we're unwilling to look at the prejudices in the alleged good guys? And this isn't some enlightened centrist, there's good and bad on both sides kind of argument. The Fire Nation are very obviously the biggest threat to the balance of the world, and Katara never loses sight of the fact that the number one priority has to be Aang's training. But to ignore the systems of oppression and prejudice that exist within your own camp is a betrayal of the entire goal of anti-imperialism. Katara is never willing to accept a half victory, and it's that stubborn tenacity that I greatly admire in her and hope to emulate in my own life. The Siege of the North has a lot to talk about, so rather than try to go in order, part 1 is going to be about Zuko and part 2 is going to be about Aang. The key to a satisfying conclusion is change. Either the characters change because of their journey, or the world changes because of the characters. And there are 2 key moments in the Siege of the North that show how far Zuko has come and where he's going to be going in the future. The first is when he reaches out to try to save Zhao from the ocean spirit. During his banishment, he's tried to suppress his innate sense of compassion, but this moment shows that in spite of all of the hardship he's endured, he still values human life at his core. And having him try to save Zhao of all people is proof positive of his kind nature. The second moment is when he's floating away at the end of the battle and his uncle Iroh says to him, "A man needs his rest." This acts as a bookend with a similar moment from The Boy in the Iceberg, and it shows that Zuko is finally ready to accept real compassion and guidance from his uncle. Surely he has fully learned his lesson at this time, right? Part 1 was about Zuko and part 2 is about Aang. Aang's story in Book 1 is primarily about the burden of power and the psychological toll that the responsibility of being Avatar takes on him. He's just a little kid, but he was denied the opportunity to have a normal childhood because of being born as the Avatar and the political circumstances of the time he was born into. And Book 1 really makes a habit of beating Aang down. He's attacked, captured, and forced to confront all manner of harsh realities that he should have been shielded from. But what makes Aang a truly compelling character is that all of his experiences push him towards acceptance of his destiny rather than renewed fear and resentment. Even though he shouldn't have to bear this responsibility, he knows that if he doesn't, someone else will, and he refuses to allow others to suffer when he can prevent it. And the battle for the North Pole is the first time that Aang fully comes into his own as the Avatar, using all of the lessons that he's learned to help win the day.